Okay, hi everyone. This is just a quick review of some of the key features of working in Photoshop, particularly for Project 2, if you happen to miss anything in class yesterday. So all I have here is Photoshop open. I'm going to go ahead and make a new file, set up my dimensions. They're already set up here. For print, you want to make sure you're using 300 dpi. Or pixels per inch. If you're using or you're designing something for screen or web use, going down to something like 72 or 150 is fine. I'm going to leave this at 300, and we'll get our blank canvas here. By default, Photoshop will set you up with a background layer. And the main method of working in Photoshop is in layers, because Photoshop does not know what objects are, since we are editing basically pixels. So we're editing raster graphics. We're not editing vector graphics, which can detect what the edges of objects are, and you can work with things by object. So much of what you're doing in Photoshop is editing pixels, usually masking things, cutting things out, or adjusting the colors or the appearance of things. So as an example, I'm going to bring an image in here. Depending on your Photoshop version, it might give you this import image context bar, but you can always drag and drop things. This is how I tend to work. So I'm going to drag this image of a bird in here. You can scale it as you need to kind of for this initial placement, but you can always transform it again later. One of the key differences from Photoshop to Illustrator is in Photoshop, your proportions when you are scaling are by default constrained. Whereas as in Illustrator, you have to hold Shift while you are transforming things. If I do that here, you can now stretch or distort the image. So I'm holding Shift right now. In most cases, you do not want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and either click Done or hit the check mark to place this image. And you'll see this has been placed on a new layer. Any new image or any new adjustment that you add to a Photoshop document will typically be placed on a new layer. So you will very often have your layers panel open as you're working. And it's a good practice to rename these. So I'm going to double click on this and just name this as bird. Okay. So let's imagine that the task I have here is I want to cut this bird out here. So I just want to see the bird. The way we're going to do that is with what's called a mask. You can think of a mask as essentially placing a sheet of paper on top of this image and then cutting a hole in that sheet of paper to just show what we want to see through that. The way you create that in Photoshop is you can use this icon down here, which is the layer mask icon, and we will get a blank layer mask. Or you can let Photoshop try and remove the background for you if that's what you're trying to do. So both of these will end up with a layer mask. You can see all that's happened here when I clicked that is it tried to detect what I wanted to show through that black mask here, which would be the same as if I added the mask myself, and then I'm selecting that mask. And let me reset my workspace so you can see my toolbar. There we go. Okay, so let's back up so that you can see what happened when we tried to remove the background. So everything in black, Photoshop is hiding from this layer. Everything in white over here is showing through. So we can do that ourselves with a paintbrush. So I'm going to add a layer mask. It's totally white, so everything is showing through. I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool, and I have black as my color. And you'll see, as long as I have this layer mask selected, once I start to paint that black color in, things get hidden. And then you'll see over here, similarly as with that last example, we have black over top of the elements that are hidden. One thing to watch if you are masking images in this way is if you happen to have the image itself selected, you will just be painting color on the image. So you need to make sure that you have the mask selected when you're using that paintbrush. In a similar fashion, if I reverse this, I'm hitting X to swap my foreground and background colors. So I'm now painting with white. I can paint elements back in, and you'll see that reflected over here. So a typical workflow, I'm going to go ahead and delete this layer mask. So we're back to our start. I'm going to let Photoshop try and do some of this work for me. So I'm going to hit remove background, and then you can see we're missing some of the key elements of this bird, like some of the feet. Perhaps I still want some of that branch, and then it's cutting some odd parts out of this other item here. So to get some more control over your masking, you can just work in this space using the paintbrush, but a nice way to work is to go into select and then select and mask. And you can see that our workspace changes suddenly. Over on the right, we have some different options for controlling our mask, and then on the left, we have some different brush options. By default, you might have this quick selection tool selected, but for this example and starting out, I would definitely work with just the regular brush tool. Up top here, you have a plus and a minus setting. So if I use plus and then I make my brush a little larger so you can see it, if I start to paint on here, you're painting items back into the mask. So this is the same thing as painting with white that we were doing before. If you use minus, you're removing things from the mask. So this is the same as painting with black. And the nice thing about this workspace is you can kind of see what's behind this image. So if I zoom in, you can see that the elements we've masked out, we can still kind of see them in a lighter transparency so that we can tell what we're working with. And the way you control that is with this transparency slider over here. So I'm turning this up to make my mask more opaque, or I can turn it down to make it more transparent. Depending on the image you're working with, you might switch your view here. So for example, our background here is very light. So if I make a mistake on this mask, what's going to happen very likely is I have a very bright tan or off-white background around my object. So I might decide to switch this to on black so that I can very clearly see when I have some of that showing through. I'm going to turn this down a little bit. And so this is a good way to check, but then you can always switch back to onion skin to see more image behind your mask. So the typical workflow here is to just decide what you want to keep in your image and go ahead and start removing the elements you don't want. So I'm working with a pretty big, broad brush here so that I can work quickly and just quickly paint out the things that I don't want. And then as I get closer to the edges, I might switch to a much smaller brush so that I have more control. And I would also zoom in here if I wanted to paint that branch out. But for this example, I think I'm actually going to keep that branch in. You can see we're missing some of the bird's foot here, so I'm going to make this smaller. The shortcut for changing your brush size is to use the opening and closing bracket keys. So if I press... Okay, sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties. Hopefully I can cut that out. So as I was saying, you can change the brush size with the forward and backward bracket key. So for example, I'm just going to zoom in and make this brush a little bit smaller and paint in those parts of the image that I want. So for example, the bird's feet, maybe some parts of this branch. Now one thing you'll see as we start to get into these details, the edges become very defined and it's really clear how we've kind of, almost with scissors, like cut around this object and maybe did a kind of poor job. So the way that you can fix that is by softening your brush. So you have this hardness slider, and what this does is this changes it from a binary showing or not showing to sort of a softer transition between what is masked and what is not masked. So if I turn this down to something like 6% and make it very large, and then I go to minus, you can see that the edges around this brush are gradually fading away. So if I turn this transparency up, you can see that it is a little softer around the edge here than if I cut this out with a very hard brush around the edges, where it becomes very clear if I miss the edge of this object. So I typically just kind of, again, work in broad strokes at first. So I'm going to make this larger, cut out some of those things I don't want, and I'm going to use a slightly softer brush since I'm getting close to the edges here. Zoom in and get some of this blades of grass away from our tree branch. Alt is your shortcut to switch between adding and subtracting. So I'm going to add maybe this portion of the branch back in. That last little bit. And then we have some areas around our bird that we still need to get rid of. So here you got to really zoom in, get your edges. Now you can do this with other methods. So for example, you can use the pen tool to select your object and then to fill in or subtract from a mask using your selection. But just for understanding what's going on when you're doing this, I recommend working with the brush tool at first, just so that you are kind of at a very low level, able to see exactly what is happening when you're masking an item. So let's add just a little bit of this branch back in, and then we will move on. So maybe I will cut this off right here. Okay. When you're working in Select and Mask, you always need to click OK when you're done to save that selection. And you can change the output of this. So you can see this is outputting to a layer mask. You could also output this mask to a new layer or to a selection. But for our purposes here, what we want, oops, we still have a little bit to get rid of there. So you can see I found that by turning the slider all the way up and seeing what was still missing. Okay, maybe I'll soften some of this up too, just while I'm here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and you'll see we now have our mask next to our thumbnail of what we've cut out. So the other portion that you might want to do in Photoshop is adjust layers. So the example we did in class was we are converting images to black and white and perhaps tinting them to a color. The way that you do this is with what's called an adjustment layer. The way you get there is with this little half and half circle icon down at the bottom of your layers panel. So you need to make sure that your layer is selected, and then you click that and you get all these different options. The option that we want is black and white, which conveniently converts everything below this layer to black and white. So just to demonstrate kind of how that works, I'm going to quickly duplicate this layer with Command J. And this is just an example, you don't have to memorize this, but then I'm going to add an adjustment layer to this bottom copy of the bird. And you can see, because that adjustment layer is between the bottom bird layer and the top bird layer, bird copy, only the items below that adjustment layer are being affected. So what happens if you don't want everything below that layer to be affected? One thing you can do is clip that layer to the item below it, which just means it's only going to affect the layer directly below it. So I'm going to double click on the adjustment here to get back into my options. And then this little icon that's the square with a right-angled arrow to the left of it will clip this to the layer below it. And you'll see this shifted over and we have an arrow pointing to just this layer. So now this mask will only affect the layer directly below. Oops, no, don't replace this. Will only affect what's directly below that adjustment as long as it is clipped. The final thing we did was we talked about tinting our images. So this is black and white now, but what if, for example, we are only working with the color blue in our design? So we want to convert this to blue to better match the rest of our design. So if I jump into those options again, you'll have this option that says tint. If you check that, you will get a default color over here in this box, but if you click that, you will get a color picker that comes up and you can select any color you want to. And then this black and white image will be filled with tints of that color that you choose. So for example, this is how we might tint our bird blue. Okay, I hope that gives you a good refresher on how to work with some of the features in Photoshop, particularly the ones that you might need for this project. But if you have questions, please feel free to reach out.